Greetings. The Battle of Megiddo was a conflict between the army of ancient Egypt, led by Pharaoh Thutmose III, and a united coalition of princes from northern Syria and Canaan allied with the state of Mitanni. This is the first battle in the history of mankind to be extensively documented. The description of the battle is found in the so-called Annals of Thutmose, the hieroglyphic texts of which are housed in the temple of Amun at Karnak in the Hall of Annals. The author of the text was a court scribe named Canaanite. Subsequently, the Valley of Megiddo became the arena of many battles, to the extent that Armageddon, or the Mount of Megiddo, is referenced in the Apocalypse as the site of the final battle between the forces of evil and the forces of good at the end of times. It is known that the battle took place in the 23rd year of Pharaoh Thutmose III's reign. However, the problem lies in the fact that the exact dates of Thutmose's reign are unknown, and therefore the battle is dated differently. The most common dates are 1502 or 1457 BCE. The same problem applies to the day of the battle. The scribe Canaanite specifically states that the battle took place in the 23rd year, first month of the third season, 21st day, coinciding with the festival of the new moon. However, determining which date in the solar calendar corresponds to the specified day in the Egyptian lunar calendar seems quite challenging. Again, the most frequently cited dates are April 26th or May 15th. According to the Egyptian version, the instigators of the war were Canaanite petty kings who formed a coalition with the aim of launching a campaign into Egypt and defeating the Egyptian army. Pharaoh Thutmose III allegedly was forced to launch a preemptive strike to ward off the threat from Egypt. However, I have no doubt that if we had received information about this battle from the opposing side, the picture would have been completely different as well. What did the Egyptian army and its commander-in-chief represent at this time? At this epoch, the Egyptian army represented quite a formidable force. If in the past, the main composition of the army consisted of militia summoned to arms in times of war, during the New Kingdom era, a professional army was established, consisting of infantry and chariotry. Among the infantry, there were archers and spearmen. Archers were armed with a bow and 2 darts. All chariot archers and some infantry archers had composite bows, made of different types of wood, with horn overlays on the weapon's shoulders, and reinforcement made of animal sinew. These bows possessed considerable penetrating power, and were quite long-range. However, since composite bows were quite expensive, some infantry archers were armed with simple bows, which were also formidable weapons at short distances. Spearmen were armed with a spear with a bronze tip, as well as bronze axes or a sickle sword called a khopesh. The khopesh was a strongly curved sword of sickle-like shape. The length of the blade was 60 centimeters. The sword itself was made of bronze and was very heavy, around 2 kilograms. Strikes with this sword were delivered with the outer curved side. Ancient sources have preserved descriptions of the devastating effect of this weapon. It inflicted terrible wounds, severed limbs, and wooden shields and bronze armor offered no protection against it. The armament was complemented by a shield half the size of a human. The Egyptian war chariots represented a formidable force. An Egyptian war chariot was operated by 2 people, the charioteer, who controlled the horse with reins and a whip, and the warrior, armed with a composite bow with arrows and several darts. In most cases, the warriors on chariots were protected by leather armor or a shield. The total number of the Egyptian army that invaded Canaan is estimated at 20,000 people, including from 1,000 to 1,500 war chariots. Leading the army was Pharaoh Thutmose III, known as an outstanding military leader who conducted numerous military campaigns. However, this campaign was Thutmose's first, and he did not yet have sufficient military experience. Nevertheless, the Egyptian army operated under complete unity of command, with the Pharaoh as the sole center of control, and no one interfered with his authority. Facing the Egyptian army was the army of the coalition of Canaanite cities, led by the kings of Kadesh and Megiddo. The armies of these cities were organized in the Hittite manner and, to a significant extent, were armed with iron weapons, which were superior to the Egyptians, whose weapons were bronze. Unlike the Egyptian army, the armies of the Canaanite cities consisted of a small professional corps, with the main mass being militia, simple peasants or townsmen who were called to arms in times of war. The structure of the army also differed somewhat. Chariots played the main role in battle, while infantry played a secondary role, tasked with providing defense for the chariots. A chariot crew consisted of 3 people: the charioteer, a heavily armed spearman with a long spear and shield, and a warrior armed with a bow or darts. The spearman was protected by scale armor. Canaanite chariots were heavier than Egyptian ones, and in a direct clash, Egyptian chariots could not withstand the direct impact of Canaanite ones. However, Egyptian chariots were much more maneuverable and stronger in combat over long distances. The infantry was armed with iron swords and spears with iron tips. Almost half of the infantry were armed with bows and arrows. However, at the onset of the conflict, the coalition had not yet assembled all the forces intended for the invasion of Egypt. Only the armies of the kings of Megiddo and Kadesh were fully present. All other allies came with small contingents, expecting to be reinforced by militia after the harvest. The total strength of the coalition forces numbered up to 15,000 men. A significant downside of the coalition army was the lack of unity of command. Each ally's units acted independently, and coordination between different units was weak. On March 31st, 1457 BCE, the Egyptian army set out from the border fortress of Jahi in northeastern Egypt and began its march towards Canaan along the so-called Way of Horus. Their target was the fortified city of Megiddo, where the forces of the Canaanite city-states had gathered, posing a threat to Egypt. The Egyptian army moved relatively slowly, averaging just over 18 kilometers per day, due to the harsh conditions of the desert through which they had to travel. Nonetheless, they covered the 187 kilometers between Gaza and Jahi in 10 days and finally reached Gaza. After a short rest, the army continued its march and, 2 weeks later, reached the mountainous village of Ikim, located at the foot of the Carmel mountain range, beyond which lay Megiddo. There were 3 ways to reach Megiddo: to bypass the ridge from the north or south, or to take the shortest route through the pass. At a military council held in Ikim, Egyptian commanders favored the northern or southern routes, fearing that the narrow mountain pass could easily be ambushed by the enemy. However, Thutmose III argued that such actions were precisely what the enemy would expect. They wouldn't believe anyone would lead an army through the central route with its narrow passes and susceptibility to ambushes. The Pharaoh ordered his troops to move towards Megiddo via the shortest path through the highland settlement of Aruna and then through the pass in the Carmel ridge. Since the pass was indeed very narrow, the army stretched out so much that there were several hours of travel between the vanguard and the rear guard. Meanwhile, the coalition commanders divided their army. The majority of the troops took up a convenient battle position near the village of Tanakh, located on the southern road, expecting the Egyptian army to appear here. A smaller, but still significant portion of the army positioned itself on the northern road, near the town of Jezreel. Only a small detachment covered the exit from the pass. However, this insignificant enemy force would be quickly destroyed by the elite units of the Egyptian army, commanded by the Pharaoh himself. At noon, the vanguard of the Egyptian army emerged onto the plain of Megiddo. The Egyptians immediately began constructing a fortified camp to cover the exit of the rest of the army from the pass. By evening, the entire army had emerged from the pass and settled in the camp. An inscription describes this: His Majesty arrived south of Megiddo on the bank of the Kina stream, when it was the 7th hour after the turn of the sun, that is, after midday. And there the camp was pitched, and the order was given to the troops, Prepare your weapons, for tomorrow morning we will advance to engage with this contemptible enemy. Thus, the risky maneuver of the Egyptian commander succeeded, and the Egyptian army found itself at the walls of Megiddo, emerging precisely between the northern and southern flanks of the coalition forces. Upon receiving news of the Egyptians' appearance, the coalition commanders hastily began redeploying troops from the southern direction towards the walls of Megiddo. In these activities, the evening and part of the night passed. Early in the morning of April 26th, or May 15th, according to other sources, the Egyptian army launched its attack against the enemy. The army was divided into two wings, referred to in the source as horns. Pharaoh personally led the southern wing and led it into battle. The attack took the Asian rulers' forces by surprise. Their defensive line collapsed almost immediately. Panic gripped the army, and infantry near the gates hurried to seek refuge behind the city walls. Retreating, the Allies were forced to abandon horses and chariots on the battlefield because the defenders of Megiddo, fearing that the Egyptians might invade the city on the heels of the retreating, did not open the gates to the combatants. They pulled their warriors onto the fortress walls, using tied clothes and ropes. The coalition army was saved from total defeat by the fact that Egyptian soldiers, instead of continuing the battle, engaged in collecting trophies and cutting off the hands of slain enemies, for which they were entitled to rewards. If they had delayed looting, they could have stormed the city on the heels of the fleeing enemy and captured it outright. We do not know who is to blame for this failure, whether Thutmose himself, who did not insist on continuing the battle and allowed the army to engage in looting, or his commanders who failed to stop him. It is also possible that the state of discipline in the Egyptian army would not have allowed soldiers to be torn away from such an exciting activity. The trophies were indeed massive. Over 2,000 horses alone were left on the battlefield. In addition to them, the Egyptians acquired about 1,000 chariots, a large quantity of armor, and iron weapons. However, the matter had to be brought to an end. Taking the fortress by storm proved to be very difficult. The perimeter of the fortress walls of Megiddo measured 325 by 230 meters. Their height reached 10 meters, and their thickness was 6 meters. The fortress could only be assaulted from the south, nullifying the numerical superiority of the Egyptians. Therefore, the Egyptian forces had no choice but to begin a prolonged siege. By the order of Thutmose III, a trench was dug around the besieged fortress, and a wooden palisade was erected, completely blocking it off. The siege lasted from 4 to 7 months. Unfortunately, the conclusion of Shanaani's inscription in the Temple of Amun is damaged, and we do not know the exact duration of the siege. However, it is known that during the siege, the Egyptians managed to gather crops from the fields abandoned by the Canaanites. When the food supplies were completely exhausted, the garrison of Megiddo surrendered. Following this, the Pharaoh made a series of very far-sighted decisions. The city and its inhabitants were spared. The princes, who were part of the coalition, acknowledged the supremacy of the rulers of Egypt and swore allegiance to him. But just in case, Thutmose left a garrison in Canaan, located in a town not far from Megiddo. The sons of the defeated princes were sent to Egypt, where they received appropriate education. As you understand, on one hand, they were hostages, ensuring the loyal behavior of their parents, and on the other hand, Egypt acquired local administration for the future devoted to Egyptian values. Raised in the spirit of Egyptian culture as loyal friends of Egypt and conduits of Egyptian influence, the sons of Canaanite and Syrian princes, after the death of their fathers, inherited their positions and served as a reliable support for Egypt in the conquered territories. So, the story of the Battle of Megiddo is concluded. If it was interesting and useful, subscribe to this channel, give likes. Goodbye.